6 people died within less than 5 minutes on the night of March 22, 2009. In the town of Carthage, population roughly 2,600, at the edge of the forests of northern New York. The number still frames every retelling. What happened there, and what later echoed in Alaska 16 years ago, was not just a crime, but the hardening of a doctrine, the slow life story of active shooter response in the United States, from birth through consequence and into uneasy legacy. The event that crystallized that doctrine in 2009 was the shooting in Carthage, New York, carried out by a soldier from Fort Drum. Lesser known is that the earliest responding trooper arrived within approximately 2 minutes, yet waited for backup under the multi-FISA containment model common at the time. A command doctrine shift that many agencies would later reconsider. 16 years ago from now places us in 2010. In Alaska, that year saw its own violent incidents, including multiple officer-involved shootings and domestic violence-linked homicides in Anchorage and the Matsu Valley. A lesser-known weather and terrain impact. The fact is that average winter response times in parts of Alaska can double compared to lower 48. Urban averages due to ice-covered roads and distances measured not in blocks, but in miles of unlit highway. The life story here is not of a single rifle or a single man. It is the biography of a response system, the evolution of doctrine of first contact in active shooter events. Shaped by tragedies from Columbine in 1999 to Carthage in 2009, and implemented in remote geographies such as Alaska. A lesser-known training detail is that by 2010, more than 60% of medium to large U.S. police departments had incorporated some form of single officer entry drills into annual qualifications, a sharp rise from fewer than 10% in 2000. Its birth began in confusion. On April 20, 1999, at Columbine High School, law enforcement followed a perimeter and containment approach rooted in earlier doctrines of barricaded suspects. A lesser-known countermeasure fact is that the 4-officer contact team concept, formalized in the early 2000s, was explicitly designed to prevent repeat delays seen at Columbine, where over 45 minutes passed before systematic build and entry. Industry did not birth this doctrine. Fear did. Politics accelerated it. After Columbine, federal grant programs through the Department of Homeland Security directed millions of dollars toward tactical equipment and training packages. A lesser-known supply constraint fact is that many small departments, especially in rural Alaska, could not afford ballistic shields costing $2,000, $4,000 per unit without federal assistance. Slowing adoption of contact team models, early prototypes, were not weapons but PowerPoint slides, after-action reports, and scenario simulations. Instructors at the Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training Alert Center in Texas began standardizing response models in the early 2000s. A lesser-known test result is that early simulation exercises showed single-officer immediate entry reduced simulated casualty counts by 60 to 70%. Compared to delayed multi-officer assembly and time-compressed scenarios, childhood of the doctrine was messy. Officers trained to wait were now told to go alone toward gunfire. The shift demanded reversal of decades of survival-oriented instruction. A lesser-known psychological effect is that heart rate monitoring during active shooter drills regularly recorded spikes above 170 beats per minute in seasoned officers, levels associated with loss of fine motor skills. Small changes mattered more than dramatic gear. Radio protocol adjustments, clear channel designation, plain language over codes, prevented cross-agency, confusion, a lesser-known production issue. Fact is that early adoption was hindered by incompatible radio systems across jurisdictions. In Alaska, troopers in municipal departments sometimes operated on different frequency bands until interoperability grants in the early 2010s. In Alaska specifically, geography shaped childhood of the doctrine. Vast distances meant that backup in 2 minutes was unrealistic outside Anchorage or Fairbanks. A lesser-known terrain impact fact is that in some rural boroughs, a single Alaska state trooper may cover patrol areas exceeding 3,000 square miles, making the concept of a 4-officer stacked physically impossible. Growth came through standardization. Alert training expanded nationally. By 2013, over 100,000 first responders had received instruction. Manuals defined steps: locate threat, bypass wounded, neutralize. A lesser-known medical fact is that bypass doctrine, moving past injured victims to stop the shooter, was shown in retrospective studies to reduce total fatalities, but increased severity of untreated injuries in early minutes. Logistics matured. Active shooter bags containing tourniquets, extra magazines, breaching tools became common in patrol cars. A lesser-known supply fact is that tourniquet distribution to patrol officers increased sharply after military data from Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated preventable death rates from extremity hemorrhage of roughly 20% without rapid control. In Alaska, integration with medevac became part of growth. Helicopter evacuation through programs in Anchorage and Fairbanks reduced transport time dramatically compared to ground and remote terrain. A lesser-known weather impact detail is that in winter months, rotary wing flights in Alaska face cancellation rates due to icing that can exceed 15%, forcing reliance on ground transport over snow-packed roads. Peak of the doctrine is hard to isolate, because success is measured in absence of higher numbers. But events such as the 2012 Clackamas Town Center shooting in Oregon, where an armed citizen confronted the shooter and rapid police entry followed, illustrated compressed timelines. A lesser-known countermeasure fact is that visible armed resistance, even without shots fired, has in several documented cases disrupted attacker momentum and reduced casualty counts. Imagine a school in Anchorage in 2010. An officer hears shots, enters alone, moves towards sound. The defining factor is time. Most active shooter events conclude within 10 to 15 minutes, often before specialized units arrive. A lesser-known command doctrine shift is that federal guidance by the mid-2010s emphasized immediate solo engagement, if necessary, marking full departure from 1990s containment models. Why did it work at peak? Because speed overwhelms planning of attackers who rely on unopposed movement. Studies of 160 incidents from 2000 to 2013 indicated that in 70%, the attacker either committed suicide or ceased shooting upon arrival of armed resistance. A lesser-known psychological effect is that attackers frequently demonstrate tunnel vision and cognitive narrowing, making sudden confrontation disproportionately disruptive, but cost accumulated. Officers entering alone accepted increased personal risk, line-of-duty deaths during active shooter responses, while statistically rare compared to traffic fatalities, carried high symbolic weight. A lesser-known training compromise is that departments often reduce time spent on other tactical skills to fit active shooter modules into limited annual qualification hours. Communities paid costs as well. Drills in schools became routine. Children practice lockdowns multiple times per year. A lesser-known psychological effect is that studies of school lockdown drills have shown short-term increases in anxiety symptoms among students, though long-term data remain inconclusive and estimates vary. In Alaska, cultural context added dimension. Many households possess firearms for subsistence hunting. Response doctrine had to distinguish between lawful gun presence and hostile action. A lesser-known countermeasure detail is that dispatch protocols increasingly require detailed caller descriptions, clothing, behavior, exact location, to reduce risk of misidentification in armed communities. The old age of a doctrine does not mean disappearance, it means adaptation. After high-profile failures, such as delayed entry in certain later incidents nationally, scrutiny intensified. A lesser-known command shift is that some agencies incorporated supervisory override policies, empowering first arriving officers to bypass hierarchical approval when immediate threat is confirmed, replacement has not been of the core idea immediate engagement, but of its support systems. Integration of ballistic shields rated to stop rifle rounds, drone reconnaissance for interior mapping, and real-time building schematics mark new generation tools. A lesser-known production issue fact is that early deployment of small drones indoors revealed signal interference problems in reinforced concrete structures, limiting effective range to under 100 meters in some tests. Legacy is layered. From Columbine to Carthage to communities in Alaska, the doctrine of immediate action reshaped training academies across all 50 states. Federal Bureau of Investigation data show fluctuations in active shooter incidents year to year, but overall, increase in reporting and classification standards over 2 decades. A lesser-known data constraint is that definitions of active shooter changed in 2013 to exclude gang and drug-related shootings, complicating direct historical comparisons. Military lessons fed civilian policing, combat casualty care from Iraq and Afghanistan informed tourniquet and trauma kit deployment nationwide. A lesser-known medical fact is that pre-hospital tourniquet application, once controversial, is now associated with survival rates exceeding 90% when applied before onset of shock. A lesser-known terrain fact is that in some western Alaska villages, exceeding 200 miles over tundra, the story that began with 6 deaths in a small, it is administrative, procedural, iterative. A lesser-known training detail is that active shooter instruction now often includes correcting early stovepiped approaches. It is the biography of urgency codified, of officers told to move toward danger alone if necessary. A lesser-known psychological observation is that repeated exposure to high-stress scenario training can both inoculate against panic and accumulate quiet burnout. What militaries and police learned was arithmetic of minutes. Most of all, they learned that geography, whether suburbs of New York or snowbound highways of Alaska, changes implementation but not the central premise. Something happened in Alaska 16 years ago, as it has happened elsewhere. An incident folded into statistics, a report added to a binder, a training block extended by an hour. A lesser-known command reality is that policy revisions often occur within 30 to 60 days of major incidents, of an idea shaped by tragedy and sustained by rehearsal. It ages each time a new countermeasure emerges. Each time a new lesson is written in the margins. Its quiet moral line is this: must decide how much of that cost it is willing to carry. On March 24, 1989, at 12:04 a.m., a tanker carrying 53 million gallons of crude oil struck a reef in Prince William Sound, and within hours, an estimated 11 million gallons were in the water. What followed in Alaska was not only one of the largest environmental disasters in United States history, but the full life story of a regulatory transformation, the birth, growth, peak, cost, decline, and legacy of the system that emerged from the wreck of the Exxon Valdez. The problem that created it began long before the hull tore open. In the late 1970s, oil of the North Slope was moving through the Trans-Alaska Pipeline system at peak volumes exceeding 2 million barrels per day. A lesser-known design compromise is that the Exxon Valdez was built as a single-hull tanker in 1986, fully compliant with international standards at the time, because double-hull construction added significant cost and reduced cargo capacity. Prince William Sound was considered navigationally manageable. Charted and trafficked since construction of the Valdez Marine Terminal in 1977, yet Quai Reef sat slightly off the main shipping lane, marked but unforgiven. A lesser-known weather and terrain impact fact is that icebergs calved from Columbia Glacier occasionally drifted into tanker lanes, requiring temporary course deviations, a practice that contributed to the vessel's altered path that night. The parents of the disaster response doctrine were industry efficiency, federal regulatory frameworks of the 1970s, and political faith in technological control. Oversight of tanker traffic involved the U.S. Coast Guard and Alyeska Pipeline. Service company, operator of the terminal. A lesser-known production issue is that by 1989, Alyeska's in-house oil spill response equipment had been reduced in scale from earlier contingency plans due to budget constraints and declining pipeline throughput. In the early hours after grounding, the captain was not on the bridge. The third mate was navigating while the vessel was on autopilot. Investigations later documented fatigue factors and alcohol use as part of the narrative. A lesser-known crew training detail is that Coast Guard records showed reductions in tanker escort and inspection frequencies in the mid-1980s. Reflecting broader staffing limitations, birth of the new doctrine began with oil spreading outward in a black sheen. Within 24 hours, slicks extended over dozens of square miles, carried by currents and wind into sensitive shoreline habitat. A lesser-known test result is that early mechanical recovery attempts using skimmers in Prince William Sound achieved collection rates far below design capacity, sometimes under 10% of theoretical throughput, due to sea state and emulsification of crude. Boom, deployment was immediate but insufficient. Containment boom, measured in thousands of feet, could not encircle the entire spill under rough water conditions. A lesser-known supply constraint fact is that only about 4,000 feet of boom were immediately available in Valdez at the time of the grounding. Far less than contingency planning scenarios envisioned. Childhood of the response system was chaotic. Workers scrambled to organize vessels of opportunity, fishing boats, and private craft into ad hoc fleets for containment and shoreline cleanup. A lesser-known battlefield improvisation analog lies in the conversion of local fishing vessels into oil recovery platforms. Using improvised rigging to tow boom sections through contaminated water. Chemical dispersants were considered. Within days, approximately 5,500 gallons of dispersant were applied in limited trials. A lesser-known countermeasure fact is that dispersant effectiveness testing in Prince William Sound showed reduced performance in cold water temperatures, averaging Y-8 degrees Celsius, limiting its operational value. As oil reached shorelines, impact multiplied. More than 1,300 miles of coastline were eventually contaminated to varying degrees. A lesser-known medical and psychological effect is that cleanup workers reported increased respiratory symptoms and stress-related conditions. Though long-term, epidemiological conclusions remain debated and estimates vary. Wildlife tolls became central to public understanding. Official estimates include approximately 250,000 seabirds, 2,800 sea otters, 300 harbor seals, and 22 killer whales affected, though precise numbers varied by methodology. A lesser-known terrain impact detail is that sheltered coves of Prince William Sound trapped oil in intertidal sediments, where low-wave energy slowed natural degradation for decades. Growth of the new system came through law. In August 1990, Congress passed the Oil Pollution Act. The act mandated double-hull design for new tankers operating in U.S. waters and established the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. A lesser-known command doctrine shift is that the act formalized the Incident Command System for major spill response, integrating federal, state, and responsible party roles into unified command. Double-hull requirement was phased in over years. By 2015, single-hull tankers were effectively phased out of U.S. service. A lesser-known design compromise is that early double-hull conversions reduced cargo capacity by several %, influencing freight economics and shipyard scheduling. Globally, escort requirements increased. In Prince William Sound, tankers were thereafter accompanied by 2 escort vessels, including at least one equipped with firefighting and towing capability. A lesser-known test result is that simulation exercises after 1989 demonstrated significant reduction in grounding probability when tethered escort tugs maintained in direct towing positions in confined channels. Industry investment surged. Exxon spent more than $2 billion on cleanup in the first years, with total costs and settlements exceeding $7 billion over time. A lesser-known production issue is that shoreline washing techniques initially employed high-pressure hot water, later criticized for additional ecological harm due to destruction of microbial communities, manuals expanded, contingency planning. Documents for Alaska oil terminals grew from slim binders to multi-volume operational frameworks. A lesser-known supply constraint fact is that stockpiling of boom and skimmers in remote Alaskan ports required heated storage facilities to prevent material brittleness in sub-zero winter temperatures. Peak of this system came not in another disaster, but in prevention. From 1990 through the 2000s, U.S. waters saw a significant decline in large tanker spills compared to previous decades. A lesser-known countermeasure detail is that vessel traffic systems in Prince William Sound incorporated radar and real tracking to monitor tanker positions continuously, reducing reliance on manual reporting. Imagine a tanker departing Valdez in 2005. Escort tugs flank it. Pilots rotate shifts under strict arrest rules. Double hull plates separate cargo from sea. A lesser-known crew training detail is that bridge resource management training, emphasizing cross-checking among officers, became standard after findings that hierarchical silence contributed to past navigational, engineering, oversight, training, and legal liability converged. A lesser-known medical and psychological effect is that coastal communities, particularly native Alaskan villages dependent on subsistence fishing, experience prolonged economic and cultural stress, with litigation stretching over 2 decades. Before Supreme Court review in 2008 reduced punitive damages, the cost was not only financial. Fisheries closed. In 1989, commercial fishing seasons for herring and salmon were disrupted across large areas. A lesser-known weather impact fact is that storm events in the months after the spill redistributed oil into previously clean shorelines, complicating containment and extending cleanup timelines. Cleanup workforce peaked at roughly 10,000 workers and 1,000 vessels during summer 1989. A lesser-known supply constraint detail is that housing for workers in Valdez required rapid construction of temporary facilities, straining local infrastructure designed for a much smaller population. Old age of the initial disaster response came as attention faded. By the late 1990s, visible oil had diminished substantially, though subsurface residues remained in pockets. A lesser-known test result is that studies in the 2000s found buried oil layers persisting in certain beach sediments more than a decade after the spill, detectable by hydrocarbon fingerprinting. Replacement did not mean abandonment of oil transport in Alaska. Pipeline throughput declined from peak to million barrels per day to under 600,000 barrels per day by the mid-2010s due to field depletion. A lesser-known design constraint is that lower flow rates in the Trans-Alaska Pipeline increase risk of wax buildup and cooling, requiring operational adjustments to maintain oil temperature. Global maritime regulation also evolved. The International Maritime Organization adopted amendments aligning with U.S. double-hull standards. A lesser-known command doctrine shift is that port state control inspections intensified worldwide, increasing frequency of structural integrity audits for aging tankers. Legacy lives in numbers. Major oil spills from tankers declined worldwide from dozens per year in the 1970s to single digits in many recent years. Estimates vary depending on definitions and thresholds. A lesser-known countermeasure fact is that satellite monitoring of oil slicks now allows detection of even smaller illegal discharges, enhancing enforcement beyond what was possible in 1989. It is of policy on paper, steel in holes, radar on shorelines, and court decisions in Washington. It is of engineers recalculating risk and of legislators recalculating liability. A lesser-known supplied detail is that the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund, financed by a per-barrel tax on oil, accumulated billions of dollars to ensure rapid federal response capability. Something happened in Alaska more than 3 decades ago, and its echoes shaped the event landscape of 16 years ago and beyond. Tankers moving more safely, oversight layered. The Ark moved from single hull to double hull, from fragmented command to unified system. The quiet moral line is this: systems often mature only after rupture, and the cost of prevention is always measured against the memory of what once leaked into the cold water of Prince William Sound.